Hi, everyone. We are going to give everyone about 2 more minutes, and then we will get started with our virtual event soon. Thanks for being here. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for this conversation on racial battle fatigue and the importance of representation in mental health services. I am Dr. Ashlee Canty, and I serve as the Director of Equity Initiatives for the Hunt Institute. I want to thank our panelists for making the time to be here with us today. They are doing crucial work, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about their experiences. Across the country, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the need for additional mental health services for students during their post-secondary education. While mental health needs have been exacerbated for many students, Black, Indigenous, and Latinx students have long been disproportionately impacted by the need for additional and more culturally relevant mental health services. This is largely due to students of color often experiencing a phenomenon known as racial battle fatigue. Racial battle fatigue is defined as a cumulative result of a natural race-related stress response to distressing mental and emotional conditions. These conditions emerge from constantly facing racially dismissive, demeaning, insensitive, and or hostile racial environments and individuals. Today's conversation is critical to ensure that Black, Indigenous, and Latinx students are able to access salient care and feel supported through their post-secondary education. Thank you again for joining us, and let's jump into the conversation. I would love for each of our panelists to introduce themselves and just give an overview of their research that highlights racial battle fatigue and the experiences of students of color on campus. So we'll start with Dr. Beatty.
Good afternoon, everyone. Kevin Beatty, he, him, his pronouns. I'm an assistant professor at Florida State University, where I teach in the higher education program and the undergraduate leadership studies program. And my particular research study that I particularly related to racial battle fatigue really looks critically at the experiences of student leaders of color, specifically Black and Latinx students, who are on the front lines of calling out racism and calling for racial justice on campus. And then how are they navigating basically the racial battle fatigue that they're experiencing, being on the front lines of calling out the racism, and then what do they learn about themselves and about leadership through that process is where my current research is exploring.
Dr. Bridges-Carter.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shenay Bridges-Carter, and I use she, her pronouns. And I am currently the Director of Clinical Services at Northwestern University Counseling Center called CAPS here on the Evanston campus. And my research particularly is really about racial battle fatigue and unconscious racial bias, primarily with law enforcement and people of color and communities of color. But but having worked on college campuses for over 15 years, and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, I see the impact of racial battle fatigue on students on campus and their willingness to engage in mental health treatment, and therefore also sometimes their academic success. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and I'm happy to be here.
Dr. Franklin?
Good afternoon, everyone. Jeremy Franklin. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm an adjunct instructor at the University of Utah and also a strategic project manager. In terms of teaching, I teach in our educational leadership department and also education, culture, and society. And a lot of my research is looking at racial battle fatigue, but from a quantitative perspective. So using what's been done qualitatively to see how we can measure it quantitatively and integrate some health psychology literature in there in terms of looking at coping mechanisms, maladaptive and adaptive, and then also looking at climate and culture and whiteness and sort of how that fits into the play. But really looking from a quantitative perspective, informed by all the qualitative work. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Miranda?
Hello, everyone. My name is Monica Miranda. I use she, her, ella pronouns, and I'm so happy to be here with my colleagues and all of you today. Although I wish we weren't having to have this conversation, right? It is a critical conversation to have. My day job, I serve as the director for the Center for Student Involvement at the University of South Florida. But I am an equity-minded scholar practitioner whose interests are really in creating the critical and safe spaces for minoritized faculty, staff, and students. And my research has been focused on Latinas in Latina sororities. And a lot of what I've learned from that research has been the experiences that the students have had in having to fight for services, fight for the lack of invisibility, right? Or the feeling of invisibility that they have on their particular campuses, and fighting against racist issues and racist situations that are going on campus. So that's where kind of my research intersects with that idea and that the experiences of racial battle fatigue and students. I also serve as a faculty member for the online higher education graduate program at New England College and teach the leadership theory and higher education course there. So lots of different ways in which I'm working with faculty, staff, and students, but particularly in the research for students and their experiences that present racial battle fatigue as a part of that.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Villalba.
Thank you very much, Dr. Canty. Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Jose Villalba. I use he, him, él pronouns. I am the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at Wake Forest University, and I'm also a Professor of Counseling in the Department of Counseling at Wake Forest. In a previous life, when I did a lot more research, like my colleagues on this call have referenced, my main focus was on issues of college access for Latino, Latina, Latinx high school students, as well as addressing health disparities in rural, burgeoning Latino communities. And so in a lot of ways, a lot of my research has dealt with the byproducts of racial fatigue on particularly immigrant populations. As the Vice President for D&I at Wake Forest, I deal a lot with the policy and practice implications of what happens when students of color, their parents, their familias have to cope with what it means to be a person of color, student of color at a PWI, and all that comes with it, all the resources and all the ability to access institutions that maybe they wouldn't have been able to access, but of course the shadow side to that as well. And so from that perspective, I come at these issues as a practitioner, as a former researcher, although I guess one would say that one is always a researcher when you do this kind of work. And so it really is a humble and unearned privilege to be in this group with you all this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Our first question will be to Dr. Beatty and Dr. Franklin. Racial battle fatigue stems from the fact that many students of color experience blatant racism and bias on their campuses. How can institutions of higher education better ensure that students feel comfortable reporting these microaggressions and racism? We will start first with Dr. Beatty and then Dr. Franklin.
Thank you, Dr. Canty, for that particular question. So I'm going to pause and for us to think more critically about the question, because oftentimes higher education institutions ask exactly that question. And then it becomes this wanting a checklist. Like, what can I do? What can I check off the list to address how people are feeling, right? And it's this issue of being comfortable when really we need to get deeper beyond the feeling of being comfortable. So when this question for institutions needs to be reframed and asked, what is your institution's history of responding and addressing racism on campus? And what is the root of why students don't feel comfortable? And all the literature, all the research, you can pick it up. We talk about campus climate, chilly climate. Some of us got sub-zero climates, right? We know it's about campus climate. And that's the question, that's the conversation that we really need to be having when thinking about supporting, having students feel comfortable. And can we critically integrate our reporting process of racism on campus? Does our process of reporting racism trigger more trauma for students who are reporting? Are the people who are responding to racism on campus and supporting those who have experienced racial trauma have the capacity to do so, right? Those are the critical questions that I think gets us at a level of comfort when trying to really uproot a climate that for decades is rooted in the history of many of our institutions and inflicting and perpetuating racial trauma on students and the surrounding community. So how does the history show up in today's context and in the lives of students? And what are you doing to create a place and space for students of color to seek and gain support as they navigate racial trauma? If we can't deal with the histories of it, then it becomes a cycle, right? Of we're having the same conversations over and over again, but we're trying to get at comfort when really we really need to be getting at the root. And oftentimes the root is rooted in the racial, the climate of the campus.
Yeah, I think to build off of Dr. Beatty's comments was really also about the culture of the institution. So the climate can change from going from, at least where I'm at, the student affairs office to the classroom climate. And I just sat in a dissertation defense yesterday where they talked about counter spaces and the role of counter spaces in student development and how the classroom was a totally different climate and culture than a lot of the student organizations. So I think some of this really comes down to what type of culture is the institution. We know the history of the culture, but what type of culture are they projecting forward? And this comes through like in terms of how are institutions holding up their end of the bargain to students? They admit students, but they're not providing a climate and culture for them to thrive without experiencing microaggressions, racial battle fatigue, race-related stress. And institutions have to hold that. So when I heard this comment, the question I thought of like, well, that might be the onus on the students. We need to turn the spotlight on the institution and see what the institution needs to do in terms of financial commitments, not a checklist, but financial commitments to mental health services. I know when I came to the University of Utah, we had a specific counselor that looked at racial battle fatigue. Now, I had to seek that out to sort of look at that as I was doing research, but it wasn't explicit throughout the university. So focusing on, racism isn't going away anytime soon, but focusing on how we can support students and while the culture changes, hopefully, in terms of mental health and mental health that focuses on race, destigmatizing mental health, and also the reporting mechanisms around racial microaggressions, and also making sure there's consequences of that in the classroom and outside of the classroom, because often this goes unseen or unseen by many people that can make decisions.
Thank you. Our next question is for Dr. Bridges-Carter, Dr. Miranda, and Dr. Villalba. And so we'll go in that order with our answers. You have we've talked some about this and it came up in some of your introductions, but when we think about how students experience racism and racial battle fatigue within their post-secondary experience, how does this impact their trajectory towards graduation? What are the implications around retention, and how does this overall impact their ability to complete their educational goals?
Thank you, Dr. Canty, for the question. I think it's a really good question, and one that's really, I think, kind of complicated, because the ways in which racial battle fatigue or experiencing racism on campus impact students can look very different from person to person. But some of the things that I see most frequently are that, and I think it's very common knowledge that the research shows that people of color have more of a predisposition to certain mental health diagnoses, right? And I think some of those predispositions are a direct result of folks' experiences being exposed to racism and being exposed to different oppressive sources. So I think some of the ways in which this kind of can show up is people feeling really isolated. They feel like the people that they interact with on campus, they don't really have a shared experience with those folks. They kind of come from two very different realities, and they don't necessarily have that ability to connect with folks in ways that we all know are very important for students to be able to do in order to build connection. And so that difficulty in building connection ends up coming up in feelings of depression, feelings of anxiety, just feeling like they're not able to be themselves. They don't have that space where they can just relax and kind of be their most authentic self. Or if they do, it's a very isolated space on campus. It's like the one place that they can go, but everywhere else they have to have this mask on or wear this facade. And that gets really wearing and tiring on people after a period of time. And so when folks have these depressive or anxiety symptoms, they don't necessarily, one, know where to go to for help, or two, we know that in a lot of communities of color, mental health treatment is still very stigmatized. And so the ability, the courage to ask for help, and then you go to ask for help and none of the clinicians in the counseling center look like you, or none of them you feel are able to relate to your background or your history. And you don't want to necessarily have to share kind of some of the cultural nuances of your background and feel potentially judged or have to do a lot of it cultural explaining of things. And so that is an obstacle for folks to get services and to get the help that they need. And so without getting this help, obviously this ends up impacting people's attendance in class, their willingness to engage in even activities outside of class. I really like the discussion about the classroom environment looking very different from the environment outside of class. But when none of those environments offer acceptance and offer a place of comfortability for the student, they really have nowhere to be themselves. And so, you know, students may not perform as well. And then they are, again, reinforcing negative stereotypes, maybe about their intelligence and things like that, according to different cultural stigmas. And so there's a lot riding on them with familial responsibilities. And so there's really just a lot of pressure that students are feeling, and that when they are struggling with racial battle fatigue, they have that much more pressure put on them to succeed. And when they aren't able to do so, or they experience difficulties, then that really weighs on them very heavily. And I think it can end up in students either failing or being put on academic probation, or even engaging in some sort of behavioral or conduct issues, right? Substance use, all of those things. So it's really complicated. I know I've probably talked too much, but I really, just want to kind of point out the complexity with which students often respond to these types of situations.
Dr. Canty asked a good question there, and Dr. Bridges-Carter is completely in my head. And so a lot of what you've already shared is what I thought about, right? And thinking about when we consider this question, a successful student is one who feels whole, is one who feels connected to the institution they're attending, is one who feels cared for, valued, supported, because they're pushing through this racial battle fatigue. They're pushing through the micro, macroaggressions on a daily basis. And you said similar words that I think use all the time, the wear and tear, right? We think about the wear and tear of a car on the road. This is the wear and tear of people, of humans, of students on their journey and in their path at an institution. And so I won't say a lot of what you said, because I completely agree with everything you said and the impact of it, the implications of it. But I also want to point towards then there's a question in the chat about how that plays out with among staff, the academic and student life professionals. And it is very difficult for me to talk about students without talking about the faculty and staff who help support those students. And so I'll take a little bit of a different frame on this question to talk about the fact that when we are trying to come up with systems and structures to support students, when we're trying to make sure that there are staff there for them, right? You mentioned the staff in the counseling centers and whether they do or do not look like these students, and that being a challenge. Well, we also have to think about what about those staff, and how are they being supported? What is the scaffolding that institution has created to support the staff who are supporting the students, right? So if we're not supporting the staff, the faculty, providing them with training, development, spaces, their own spaces. I mean, just recently at the University of South Florida, I was honored to come together with a group of people. We've been meeting since April, and in October, we launched Alianza Latina Faculty and Staff Association. Yes, we never had one before. So we just launched that. We have our next general body meeting, just our second one next week. And so it's about what is the institutions as they're thinking about what they're doing for the students and thinking about how this plays out and the implications for students. The staff also need to have some kind of support too, so that they can better be okay for themselves, so that they can then be better for the students. So there's, I think, an onion that we can continue to peel the layers off of that really make us, or I think for this, we need to consider what is the scaffolding that we have in place, not just for students, but those staff and faculty who are also supporting those students, particularly if they're staff and faculty of color.
So, Dr. Canty, it's moments like these when I really resent the fact that my father's last name is Villalba, which means I'm always going to go after a Dr. Bridges-Carter and a Dr. Miranda, never mind a Dr. Beatty and a Dr. Franklin. So thanks, Papa, for the last name. So I'm going to try to do justice by the folks that have already gone. And I'm going to, like Dr. Miranda just did, kind of deconstruct your question a bit, right, Dr. Canty? Because you mentioned and you put the focus on a student's trajectory towards graduation. And what I appreciate about this question is that it's not asking us for any solutions, quote unquote, although Dr. Miranda did a fantastic job of offering some really important ones. But it does question those 240 people or so here to raise their level of awareness. So let me go backwards and let me go forwards for a bit, right? I mentioned I was a counselor, and so Donald Super talks a lot about one's professional development arc. And so if you think about racial battle fatigue and you think about 5-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 16-year-olds, way before they get to any of our institutions, particularly Black, Brown, Native American, Southeast Asian, first-generation immigrants, students who are learning English for the first time, LGBTQ, the intersectionalities of all the things that we all work with, those kids are that car that Dr. Miranda had referenced, right? And so that racial trauma, that ethnic trauma of carrying that, a slight here, a misunderstanding from a teacher there, a school counselor who sells them short, they arrive in our spaces with that. And we have this tendency, particularly in our culture, to elevate and romanticize resilience. And resilience is incredible. Resilience is what's gotten us to where we are. But resilience can be a lot like being bilingual. Bilingual is also great. And there's also a shadow side to that as well, right? And so we tend to elevate this concept of resiliency without realizing, wow, what did it take for somebody to have to put up and deal with all of that? So let's increase our awareness on how long our students of color have been advocating for themselves and with their familias and kinfolk and so. So let me jump a little bit ahead too, because Dr. Miranda, I appreciate you queuing this up for me. There's an interesting concept here, because Dr. Miranda, you talked about the staff members that we oftentimes don't think about, the faculty members as well, people of color who help these students. And I don't know what the stats is, because remember, I don't do research anymore. However, a lot of these students end up becoming, a lot of these undergraduate students and graduate students end up becoming the people on your screen. And chances are the people on the other side of the screen as well. And so how do we prepare Black, Indigenous students of color to advocate for themselves, to carve out self-care, to intentionally grow their professional development so that they can either advocate at their institutions for more resources, knowing full well they're going to bear a brunt that is different and heavier than their white colleagues? And how do they also establish meaningful mentorship relationships as well? A lot of folks that look like me have gone on to do things outside of higher ed, full stop. But I wonder what the stats would say around folks who continue to stay in and say yes to positions and sign up for volunteer opportunities that really don't feel like volunteer. But if it's not me, then who is it gonna be? So thank you for queuing that up, all of y'all, all the doctors in the room.
Thank you. The last question we have written, and then we'll move to the chat, is the following, and I'd like everyone to answer this. And we will go in reverse alphabetical order. So Dr. Villalba will go first. So mental health for higher education institutions has become more critical due to the COVID-19 pandemic. As institutional leaders and state policymakers think about addressing mental health needs, how can they ensure that their policies and interventions are thoughtful in addressing the needs of students of color on campus? Are there best practices and research that we should turn to when we're having these discussions and making these decisions?
So I'm going to tackle the policy part, because I think the one thing that oftentimes frustrates me about policy is the idea of one size fits all. Right. So we're going to write a policy that is equal. There's no such thing as an equal policy because it impacts people in inequitable ways. Right. So if you're going to write a policy or revamp a policy, particularly around mental health and COVID, then address the intersectionality of COVID, period. Address the fact that a lot of folks from underrepresented and or under-resourced populations are working 2 or 3 jobs, have to wait in line for some sort of handout or some sort of assistance from the federal government or from a university. So to sit there and say, well, we're going to provide more hours or more services in the mental health centers because of COVID. Okay, so that's one step. So in that case, there's pandemic fatigue, but that addresses the acute pandemic of COVID-19 and not the chronic pandemic of systemic and oppressive racism. So let's rework and revamp policies in a way that deal with the intersectionality of not just identities, but also of social strife and of medical inequity and of health inequities. Then we can actually maybe get someplace to where any of the practices that end up stemming from that have a bit more staying power and a bit more impact than, well, we rework the COVID-19 policy. There'll be a COVID-20 and a COVID-22 somewhere down the road. And so we don't address these things now, we might as well not waste our time and go back into the trenches, which is where a lot of us are.
I think what that makes me think about, I think in this question and thinking about this, I have a lot more questions than I actually have answers. And it's because it kind of goes along with a little bit what you're saying, Dr. Villalba. You're talking about the policy piece and what it needs to be considered with regards to policy. I'm looking at it from the perspective of who is involved in creating that policy. Who are people including in the creation of that policy? Who is involved in creating the interventions? Who is leading those interventions? Are they reflective of the population those policies and interventions are going to serve? And have they actually spoken to the students, the staff, the faculty, the whomever is going to be a recipient of those interventions or policies, or someone who's experiencing those interventions or policies? Are they even being spoken to? Or is it just a group of talking heads in the top, executive leadership who are not really connected, who are somewhat disconnected to the actual experience that's happening on the day-to-day? And so who's involved? How are they involved? At what point are they involved? and where the partnerships with student government, with student organizations, particularly student organizations focused on supporting the minoritized students to directly understand and design the interventions that are suiting their particular needs, in addition to considering then the intersectionalities of all those groups too. So again, I feel like I have more questions than answers, but that's what I think is most important in this process, is that deconstruction, right? What is there? Asking the questions to then reconstruct the services that will best serve the students of color. And again, I will always circle back to, if you've got staff and faculty supporting these students, what are these interventions and policies, and how are they then allowing them to do the services that they need to do, provide the services and interpret policies in a way that are actually going to be helpful for students, where they don't feel like there's going to be any repercussions for how they're interpreting the policies to best serve the students.
Dr. Franklin?
Oh, yeah, I think I would agree a lot with what Dr. Miranda said, in terms of, if you're trying to serve a population, you need to understand what they experience. So talking to students, faculty, and staff who experience racial microaggressions, and bringing that together with, I guess, critically racial conscious mental health services, shall we say, in terms of building a system that supports individuals in these times and past times and future times. So I think really speaking to students and understanding, what do they need? What supports do they need to thrive on campus? Same with faculty. A lot of faculty get burnout from multiple responsibilities because they are from a minoritized group, and that sort of goes unseen in terms of faculty leaving institutions of higher ed because of burnout, because of racial battle fatigue. And I know in the state of Utah, that's happening for staff as well. In terms of, staff are often the first people that students encounter. It's not necessarily perhaps a faculty member, but staff, and understanding how staff are impacted by sort of, hearing about racial battle fatigue and racial microaggressions, not just experiencing it. So I think there's a lot of things that we can learn from the individuals who are sort of on the receiving end, and marrying that with critical mental health services and other sort of cultural type changing the culture at institutions of higher ed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I am glad to go after Dr. Franklin, because a lot of what I have to say kind of is connected to that. I think a lot of times we think about best practices, and sometimes I'm like, best for whom, right? And who is determining what is best practices? And I think we have to be able to kind of think outside of the traditional notion of what's going to be good for students, what are the resources that students need, because we can double the budget of a counseling center, but if the healing that students are looking for doesn't take place in the traditional modality that counseling centers provide, then that's useless, right? So we have to be able to think about other entities that we can collaborate with and that we can bring into the institution without seeing it as a threat, right? Or seeing it as intimidating. I mean, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and I get paid through insurance when people come to see me. But at the same time, I don't feel intimidated by the idea of life coaches or by the idea of Reiki healers and other folks who are able to provide healing to students in a way that speaks to that student. So I often think about best practices, best for whom, right? Who's doing the research on the best practices, and on whom is that research being done? And so I think a lot of times institutions, depending upon, again, going back to the culture of an institution, I think a lot of times it can go from the top down in terms of we say we want students to have this wellness mind frame and take care of themselves, but we don't create an environment where that's a realistic goal for students. And it's not a realistic goal for students. It's not a realistic goal for faculty. It's not a realistic goal for staff. It's not a realistic goal for anyone there. And so we really have to be intentional and mindful about kind of putting our proverbial money where our mouth is when it comes to our efforts and what we are putting out there into our campus communities and our campus environments. And we have to be able to walk the walk and not just talk the talk. And I think a lot of times this can come out in terms of like where you see a university putting money. And I noticed that universities will be very apt to put money towards buildings and towards certain things, but they don't put it into the people who are in those buildings, the people who are going to be utilizing those services and what their needs are. So I feel like I'm saying a lot and saying nothing at the same time because it's just one of these really ambiguous things where I feel like it's hard to kind of pinpoint, what there is to do except just to listen to the people who are needing the help. And I think COVID has really like taken a spotlight and shown it on a lot of these inequities. And it just let us see even more clearly a lot of the inequity that already existed. And I think once COVID is over, whatever that looks like we will still be dealing with the ramifications of what people have experienced, right? And I think coming from a trauma-informed dynamic, like we can really look at this as a trauma, a collective trauma that folks have gone through, and really using that lens to inform any interventions that we do, any best practice that we come up with. I think we have to really look at it from a lens of looking at it from folks who have been through something to its core. When I heard about the Omicron, I might be pronouncing it wrong, I think there's debate on how to pronounce it, variant, I just was like, not again. I'm like, we just like, the hits just keep on coming. And I know that folks feel like that all the time about things. And so how do we restore people? How do we make them feel cared for? And how do we make them feel valued? And so those are the things that I think are really important for institutions to look at, not only for students, but again, for faculty and staff as well.
Dr. Beatty?
So going last, I don't want to be redundant, but I want to amplify definitely some of the points that my colleagues have just raised. And I'm going to probably talk from the more higher ed leadership side than the policy side that was noted earlier. And first off is just, can higher education administrators, leaders, faculty, staff acknowledge racial trauma as trauma? Is it even an option in our mind that is what a student might be experiencing? I don't even think we're there yet. So I think that's the first thing, is that racial trauma is an option that students might be struggling with and having to navigate through. So then where do you go from there? And Dr. Franklin highlighted this, right? So an RA, an academic advisor, a student advisor, those become first responders to that racial trauma, right? Those are who the students are going to experience. That's who's going to notice when a student is apathetic, is showing depressive states, is going through things. Somebody's going to notice that. Well, who are those people that notices it? And if we build up their capacity to be able to provide and offer those resources, that racism, racial trauma is trauma, right? And can we have that conversation? The next part of that is thinking about the holistic care and holistic health, right? So when we think about trauma, it is emotional, it is psychological, it is mental, but it's also some physical, right? So Dr. Bridges-Carter, you named this earlier, right? Like when we experience racism, that's the stress of racism puts a physical toll on our body. That's where inflammation, that's where other sicknesses start to happen, right? And we need to acknowledge that as a part of the trauma process and the holistic development. And the other part is the spiritual, right? We need the emotional, the mental, the physical, but there's also a spiritual aspect that also has to be a part of the option of thinking about resources. Now, I'm not talking about religion, and if it's religion for you, it's religion for you. For other people, it might be some yoga, right? But those are resources and things that we can offer as a part of this holistic development of coping, right? And I know there's some critiques of coping because it doesn't get at the change, the disruption, the things that need to be dismantled that are producing the racial battle fatigue. But when I talk about coping, I'm talking about the strategies of survival, resistance, and maintaining peace that my mother, my grandmother, my ancestors have really rooted in me being able to sit and have earned a doctorate, right? Like that was some real coping. That was some real trauma that they've experienced. So how do we think about the coping strategies for the students and the staff, the faculty that we want to support? And then my final note is really thinking about, as my colleagues have noted, higher education campuses, policies, and practices still need to be held accountable for the racial trauma that they produce and reproduce. There are policies on our campus that cause racial trauma to our students. Can we have an honest conversation about that? I'm gonna be quiet.
Thank you all for your insight. We do have a few questions from the chat and from the chat box. I see that Dr. Franklin has answered one and two in the chat, but if there are any additional resources to think about this issue as the way that it impacts Indigenous students, what are the resources? What does the research say? And Dr. Franklin, if you have additional pieces to add, feel free to do that. But if not, I welcome our other panelists to speak to the resources and tools for supporting Indigenous students.
I don't have any other specific resources, but I think, just to sort of speak to that question is, there's so much that has not been put in research, shall we say. People know the lived experience, but it hasn't been done via research and published, partially because of people preventing research, critical research like this coming out in higher ed journals and K-12 journals. So I think there's so much room for literature around racial battle fatigue to grow that we just don't know about, partially because of the history of publishing in K-20 journals. But there are some resources out there. I think a lot of it looks at racial microaggressions, and a lot of it you have to go to health psychology literature. That's where a lot of literature occurs around racial trauma, which might be distinguished from racial battle fatigue a little bit.
Thank you. We have another question. When George Floyd was murdered in front of the world, I couldn't understand my overwhelming feelings of rage and sadness until I learned about vicarious trauma, and the knowledge of having a name for it gave me peace and a starting place to work through my feelings. I believe students are experiencing this as well. I would like to know your thoughts on vicarious trauma and ways we can work with students towards healthy mental health living. And I'll pose this to Dr. Beatty, Dr. Bridges-Carter, and Dr. Franklin.
I can go first if that's okay. I just wanted to say I completely agree. And I think that I often advise the students that I see to, and somebody put in the chat, protect your peace. And I think that there's a balance between doing what you need to do to protect your peace, which might include not watching those types of videos and things like that, which I have had to do for my own personal mental health, but also wanting to stay informed and wanting to be aware of what's going on. And so I think that folks have to find a balance that works for themselves. But I think vicarious trauma is absolute. People are experiencing it all of the time. And for me, I get a physical reaction if I even think about watching videos, or if I even hear that there's a video. Like, I'm afraid that I'll accidentally see it. And so I think a lot of folks, they watch it, they want to be informed, they want to be in the know, but the impact that the cumulative watching people of color literally die on camera, like, that is traumatizing. There's no other word for it. And I think the impact that it has on our sense of safety, the impact that it has on our sense of mental well-being or being a whole person, because everybody's just watching this like it's entertainment for spectators, it's really a cumulative breakdown of what feels like a sense of personal safety. And so I think people need to do what they have to do to protect their peace. If they just want to read about it, like I've taken to reading about videos. Like for me, that's better than watching it or reading other people's reactions. And so doing things that strike that balance between being informed, but not disrupting your peace by seeing things and exposing yourself to images that disrupt your peace.
The only thing I'm going to add, because Dr. Bridges-Carter, knocked it out of the park in the sense of protecting and the traumatizing of it. The other piece is that is like it's empathy, right? So like the trauma is rooted and we're empathetic feeling, and sometimes we need to get at the root of, because sometimes that vicarious trauma is exacerbating a trauma we haven't dealt with or we have minimized or suppressed. So I think when those feelings come up, I think we have to explore what is the trauma within us. And sometimes it is like that black man could have been my son, right? And sometimes it's some other things in our past that we haven't necessarily worked through. And can we use that feeling as an invitation to dig deeper to some of the other traumas that we might be dealing with, that this is now exacerbated by continuously, as Dr. Bridges-Carter noted, continuously watching and being re-traumatized. Is there some work that this can invite in for us?
Thank you all. We have a question in our chat again. And Dr. Villalba, I will pose this to you, as I know in your role as Chief Diversity Officer, the reach that you have in some of the work that's been done at Wake Forest. So I'm in California and trying to figure out if we could promote legislation that would support more culturally sensitive mental health services to address racial, intersectional, COVID trauma on higher ed campuses. Do any of you have examples or ideas of legislation that could help push higher ed to increase resources? We'll start with Dr. Villalba, and then if there's any other panels that would like to answer, feel free to.
Thanks, Dr. Canty. I'm going to reference something Dr. Beatty said earlier about higher ed needing to be honest with itself and calling racial trauma what it is, an illness, a condition, something that is real and not fake. And if higher ed has a hard enough issue believing that racial trauma is a thing, you can imagine it has an exponentially harder issue with realizing that vicarious trauma is a thing. I don't know what y'all's people's problem is. It's just the video. It's just something that, and so in looking at that question posed from our colleague in California, this is my idea. We have funded in K-20 education for years a variety of things, and in public health for that matter, a variety of illnesses that are real, right? Whether it is an ailment, whether it is a special education program, whether it is a reading program, whether it is a Head Start program, there's all of these things that the research says, are issues that need to be addressed. So it's not that complicated to use that same framework of we're going to use funding to repair an ill. It just takes acknowledgement that the research tells us that vicarious and racial trauma have a disaggregate impact on people of color. And so if we can use research to buttress that, then we should be able to either reallocate resources that are being misused in a way that don't do much for anyone, or secure new resources to address these issues. We haven't always had COVID prevention campaigns. We haven't always had polio prevention campaigns. We haven't always had special education or Head Start programs. And yet the research backed those up. So we should be able to do the same thing and not overly complicate this as a, well, what kind of initiatives do we need? Dr. Bridges-Carter probably sits on dozens of really good and helpful and best practice approaches to dealing with these kinds of issues. So do that. but just get out of your own space that we need more research and we need more backing. We don't need any more proof that vicarious and racial trauma are real things. And so what does it look like for legislation? Well, again, challenging our elected officials to do what they've always done, whether it's with supporting infrastructure, or whether it's with supporting a new clinic, or whether it's with supporting a new program, or whether it's with supporting a new public health campaign. Just do that thing over again and stop trying to overcomplicate any of it. It's in a very sad, almost frustrating way. It's not that hard to provide resources for the things that Dr. Beatty, Dr. Bridges-Carter, Dr. Franklin, and Dr. Miranda have all mentioned and spoken to. We have all the proof that we need, quantitative and qualitative. And for people like me, mixed methods, period, full stop. And if the last thing you need is to establish some sort of panels with the Assembly in California or with congressional panels in DC, we would have a line out the proverbial door to speak truth to that power in a way that is compelling, and more importantly, is a commitment to repair what is broken. That is what we can do. That is what we should do. And that is what we must do.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes left, so that means we only have time for one additional question. And so this, I'll ask the question that came in first from Lois Williams. And this question is more of a personal question to our panelists, and those who feel comfortable answering, please do. So there has to be a way to guard our peace and not turn away from and pretend racial micro and macroaggressions don't occur. How do you all as panelists handle this in your work? How do you address it? But also, as we've stated before, guard your peace.
So if I can take this one, I'll start this one off. Goodness, I have so many thoughts of what Dr. Villalba was talking about as well. So here's what I'll say. I can't help, and this goes to this question as well. I can't help but think about how there is restorative practices that could be and have been a good way of framing conversations. But then that goes back to the sense of, well, then people need to be willing to actually work on the restoration, right? And be able to admit that these are issues, these are experiences that are real, that are happening, that are being felt. And so we would have to admit that it's happening on our individual campuses in order to actually do something about it, or our organizations to do something about it. But I think the way I have really worked with students, but also as a Latina professional, as a Latina director, mid-level manager, where students are like, oh, wow, who have come to me saying, wow, I've never seen someone in a leadership role that looks like me. I now think I can do that, right? So that's a lot of responsibility. I love to hear that, but I think it's about letting go of the fear of having the conversation. And if we just stop trying to figure out how to frame the conversation and just think about having the conversation, we don't have to build a curriculum when a conversation has to happen. So stop building the curriculum that has the answers to all the questions because we have all the answers to all the questions. We don't, y'all, we don't. The students want to come together in community. They're asking us to create a safe space so that they can talk about things, so that they can restore some of their community in what's happening in the world. But yet we're creating a curriculum, or we're talking about what we do as an institution. That's not the point. It's not about putting out there what we're doing or the resources all the time. It's about just letting them talk, letting them say what they have to say, and also creating the space that as an administrator, I can come into that conversation and say what I have to say, and also say that I'm feeling it right there with the student, and not feel like I'm going to be judged later in my job or in my day-to-day job because I can't do the work because I'm also feeling it with the students. It's actually helping me connect with the students because they recognize I'm feeling it with them. And so I think it's a couple of things that I feel like I've done, is creating the safe space that's open, to have a conversation and let the conversation flow with good facilitators of a conversation, not a curriculum, but good facilitators. And we also always have somebody from the counseling center. And we also try to make sure that someone from the counseling center is matching and is aligned with the identity of the group of students we have in the conversation. Because we also have done specifically, particularly in the fraternity and sorority community here, we've done identity-based conversations. So only the people who identify within that identity can be in that conversation, to provide that extra feeling of safety in that space. And let's not curriculum it. Let's not do that. Let's just have the conversation. And I think the other part in me is, as an administrator, when I see that there's a gap, I'm just going to do it and fill it. And so this whole last 2 years, I have been in pinch points, in passion projects, in sharing my pinch points with executive leadership this year in a really fearless way. I don't know what got into me. I can't tell you what that is, but I can tell you that I saw the gap in not having a faculty and staff association for Latinx, Latina, Latino, Hispanic, and Latin American identified faculty and staff. And so found some people and we put it together, and we're about to have our second general body meeting, right? So for me, my way of protecting my peace is to make sure that someone else might have a better experience than I did. And that I can create a path for someone to have space where they can feel better and more valued. So I need to do something. I'm that person that kind of needs to do something. And that's how I protect my peace, by trying to create peace for someone else that comes after me. So those would be the two different ways, right? Taking the curriculum out, just having a conversation with facilitators, not talkers, facilitators, and then just sometimes just do it and create what isn't there so that you can create that peace for each other.
Thank you. We have time for one more panelist to respond to this question.
I just want to say real quick, less committees about talking about stuff and more doing. Cut the check. Like I'm so exhausted of committee upon committee upon committee. Like we have a committee to talk about forming a committee. Done. Do it. That's it. They can get it done if they want to. I've seen it. Let's do it.
Okay, well, that is the end of our time together today. I would like to thank all of you for coming and being a part of this conversation. I love the conversation in the chat and how people were able to connect. I also have to thank our panelists of new friends and old friends. I'm so grateful for you all for showing up today, for engaging, and I'm also grateful for the research that you're doing and how you're making this world a better place and the meaningful ways that you engage with students of color on your campuses. And last but certainly not least, my colleagues who have been behind Black screens, Sherelle, Julia, and Abigail. We could not do this without you all. And so I'm so grateful for you all being here and being a part of this and having been working with you. I will put in the chat a link. We have the Hunt Institute hosts webinars every month. We focus on early childhood, K through 12, post-secondary, and race and ed. And each month our race and ed series focuses on a different area throughout the Institute. And so we would love for you all to come back and to learn more and to be a part of this. If there's anything at all that I can do at the Hunt Institute or anything that any of our panelists can do to support you in your work, please don't hesitate to reach out. I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day. And I look forward to engaging later. Thank you.